think it's very important to have conversations with like-minded artists who have been creating for much longer than I have. Artists like Eric Canetti knows exactly what I'm trying to do and where I'm trying to go.
And then when you're ready, we'll both clap. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yep. Go. 2, 3. 1, 2. That works. We are not quite podcasting yet, so. But not only that, but you don't really care for it anyway, so it's not like it's not like a necessity for you. But me, I die if I don't have something I love, my camera, forever.
Yeah, I'd come to learn that you're big on the cameras. Me personally, I'm just like, whatever it is that makes my job easy, and I just hit the on button. By the way, you're going to get a gap in this audio because I'd realize in as much as I hit the record button, I did not unmute the microphone.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Because that's going to help me sync on my end.
Yeah.
So I'll just sync out the spots that have echoes and stuff. But you should be okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. I've
like
tried to accommodate.
Like you said, I've been doing this for 2 years, right?
It sounds like. It sure looks like. Anyway. Another thing is that you're going to have to excuse the velociraptor that is the kids outside this door.
That's even better.
Yeah? Is it?
Yes.
Does that add charm and texture?
I don't want any of this to look and feel like I'm interviewing someone I don't know.
Yeah.
And that it's out of your own life. You know, like I want it to be a part of who you are. And if my fiance comes walking in his tighty whities,
is that just what happens? He just walks in with his underwear. He's aware. No. He's aware that you're talking to people and like setting up your podcast. Right?
Yeah, he wouldn't do that. But if he did, that would be a first.
Yeah, and we just have to keep that in too. That just adds, like I said, the texture.
Yeah, texture. That's what we want, texture, because that's what we do for a living. We add textures to our work.
That's right.
It's a good way to put it.
How are you? How is everything? How are your books? How are your projects? How is your creative output?
So here's the thing.
Yeah.
I've been stalking you for a while. Obviously, I was on your live stream when you were drawing and promoting your book.
Yeah. And, thank you so much for that support. I really appreciate it.
And I was like, I expect nothing less but like beauty. And oh my God, I was so right. So I was already going to ask you about your experience with like kickstarting or crowdfunding your own book and then having a team. And because I know you're super busy and you're constantly like drawing on. Yeah, I see your drawings all the time. I'm like, how does he do all of that and have a full plate? Like now I know you wake up early now, but regardless of that, you've always been prolific with making and creating stuff. So when you stepped into this arena, I was curious, like emotionally and mentally, how you prepared yourself for it, or if you were just like, I'm just gonna do it.
Yeah,
like,
it's that second part. I think.
Yeah, you were like, don't overthink it, right?
Is it the same with you, where like, I know people have a tendency to like plan. I think it's in there. It's one of their greater strengths, I believe. As a matter of fact, it's something that I'm really super. I admire it in people whenever they have that level of like, planning, coordination, scheduling, all of those things that I would think would help benefit a project. But I know myself enough where I know like the first thing that I need to do is sort of get comfortable with the idea of doing this thing that potentially could seem insurmountable. So I just do, right? And then I start planning thereafter. And I know that seems a little bit counterintuitive or at the very least counterproductive. But for me, I know myself enough where I'm like, I could sit here and plan, and I'm sure this would all make sense on paper, and it feels really, really good. I think I just have I don't have as much of an appreciation when I do it. I just know that I work better if I start going and then going, okay, now though, what's the railroad track look like in front of me? Where am I aiming this railroad track towards? And then start doing it that way. Because at that point I go like, I left the station already. I'm going. There's no way for me to turn this thing back and slow down. So let's go.
That's exactly how I am.
Yeah. Thank goodness.
And I think when people look to other people for advice, once you take someone else's advice on how you operate on anything, on any level, you become them in a way, without like, you're disregarding your true nature, and you kind of have to take what you have
Yeah.
and see how you work best. As long as you know what your end result is, you kind of just feel your way through it. I know
Yeah.
it sounds horrible. It's not like set in stone. Some people want like a straight path, and you could say,
Yeah.
this is how I did it. But if your personality is like, I hate working in the morning, or my mornings are
Yep.
gone,
Yep.
then you have to reverse it.
Yep.
And you just have to, some people like to do chunks at a time, while
Mm-hmm.
others like a little, like to chip away at things. And I realize I'm not a chunk kind of person.
Me
I
neither.
try doing that and I give up. So it's when I do little things at a time and I get frustrated, like even drawing comic book pages.
Yeah.
That's when I do the best, is when I'm just like, okay, just draw the tree. You want to draw the tree? Just draw the tree.
Yeah. Yeah. I then let's go back to what you just said right now. Like, you get a ton of advice because it's like social media is so wide open to different sorts of like experiences, all sorts of different processes. And you get a lot of these artists whom you potentially could admire. And then you see how they work and you're like, oh, so, depending on where you are in your development, depending on where you are in your career, it could be sort of like this great revelation. Oh my gosh, they do everything at 4 a.m. and they seem to be incredibly productive, and their output is like amazing. And then you try it and you're like, crap, this doesn't work for me, right? So I think I want to go back to something that you said, which is like, go out and figure out what works for you. I think like, if there's any advice that I can give somebody when they're talking about their scheduling, when they're talking about like how to optimize for their output, what works for me isn't going to be immediately implementable to you. I think another thing I want to highlight in what you said is like, what is your goal? And find ways in by which you can facilitate to get to that goal. Because I think a lot of people work very differently than I do. I'm up at 4 a.m., right? Working as much as I can until closer to 7 when the entire household wakes up. So that gives me 3 hours in which I have concentrated time. And the only person that's working against me then is me, because I can get easily distracted by stuff. But that doesn't mean new artists or artists who are trying to do the same thing that I am, they don't have to adopt that. If it worked for you, then awesome. You don't owe me any money. Congratulations, that worked for you. But find the thing that works for you.
Yeah, and so what time do you go to bed then if you wake up at 4? Like, when do you stop working?
That's a great question. These days, I'm in bed by 10 p.m., sometimes 11. But if I'm on and I can feel that I'm on, which I'll always end up paying for the day after. I understand the consequences of this, but if I'm on, I won't go to bed until like 1. But I know like I need to be up in 3 hours. It's the most counterintuitive concept, which is like, I feel this great surge of energy and inspiration, and obviously like this image that I'm drawing right now feels really good, and I'm close to finishing just one more panel or just like one more section, but I literally have to force myself to step away. Like that level of discipline, because I know it compounds, right? Like I can do it and say, hey, that felt so good. That page or that panel or that image is done. That painting is done. But then the next day, I'm the most unproductive, I feel, right? Where I'm like, it takes me a little while to get into the groove of things, and it just cascades into the rest of the day, potentially the day thereafter. So I have to look at it I have to take a step back and look at it more holistically, right? I can either finish these panels, this page right now, this painting right now, blah, 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 but then I take a look at like, how's that going to impact me the day after?
That
Which is
comes
like
with
old man thinking.
Experience, right? Yeah, I was going to say, that's how I am now, but when we first started, we obviously didn't think that way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no. I mean, that's why I have such a level of admiration and jealousy for people who are at the beginning part of their careers, who are just like cranking every day. I don't ever want to tell them to slow down, but also I feel like I have to tell them to slow down. It's this weird,
Like a little warning thing. Like, hey,
yeah.
just so
It's like you go into this. I cross a certain age and experience threshold where I feel like I am in this mentorship. Like that's almost. I'm almost compelled to do that, or like that's amazing, but you need to slow down, because what you're looking at is not the sprint. You're looking at the marathon. And you can't tell kids who are at the beginnings of the career to like slow down, because they're just built for it. They're just built to stay up all night and multiple days over and over again. What they don't see is like, you can't talk about burnout because you can't tell somebody something is hot until they touch it themselves, right? You can't talk about like 10 years down the line in their career, because who knows how they'll develop, right? Will they get faster? Will they get better? Like there's no way to do that with like 100% certainty that it's going to be exactly the way I experience things. But the best way I can explain is just like measure everything to your goals, right? Are you accomplishing everything that you are accomplishing by doing 30% less than what you're accomplishing? Or is it just because you have like a ton of energy and you just want to pour it into this career?
That's true. That's a beautiful thing to see, though, when you find someone who pours all that energy and they're young.
Oh, yeah.
Really good.
It's
beautiful.
That's the part that makes me mad. That's the part that makes me jealous, is when they're young and they're really good. Anybody in their early to mid 20s, where I'm like, geez, Louise, I wish I was that accomplished at 20 in my craft, you know? But then, you know, there's no way to rewind that time back. I realized that there are resources available to these 20-year-olds that were not accessible to me back then. And so I always look at it in context, right? I try to do it in relative to, oh, wow, that's a 24-year-old who has the tool sets, the utility that I never had. No wonder they're so good, you know? So I celebrate that more than...
Is there the same amount of, do you think that even though there's more resources, the same output or the same artists that end up succeeding are the same amount that when you and I were, you know, starting out without the internet and stuff, is the same percentage, would you say? Because there's people who, there's so much of it that they take it for granted. And even with us, there wasn't a lot of it, but only a few people were willing to seek it out. So it all kind of levels itself out, it seems like.
That may be true. The other component to that is that, you know, because everything is so accessible, it's no longer unique to like the handful of people that used to, like, if we were to time travel back then, I suspect that we would be hanging out with those same exact set of people, like similar people. What happens now is that all of that information is accessible to everyone. And therefore, to your point, anybody who has this sort of like tenacity and like the motivation to go and get good, they have access to any and all of that. Now, that pool of like really good, really exceptional people is massive now. I would say conservatively 3x, 5x than what it used to be before. And so now not only is the challenge getting relevant and competent at your craft, it's now sort of like getting the attention, you know, like making sure that you're employable. What makes you that much more exceptional than the 3 or 4 other people behind you? Whereas in the past, that was a little bit more, as a geography, it was a little bit easier to navigate.
That's true. And I guess that now that you mentioned the influence of social media and just the way that everybody gets the attention on, I think Francis and I talked about it, because I think what's nice about our generation of artists is we kind of got a little bit of both. So you know what it's like to have both. Whereas you have the slightly older generation who they're trying to do both, but then it's a little hard and they're falling behind a little bit. And there's young kids who don't get it, like how hard it was. But then, you know, that's kind of why you and I are here right now, still trying to push to see how far we could get. Being completely satisfied, I think, to some extent with what I'm doing. However, I am jealous of you because you got to do your thing, like to figure it out. And,
you have your own book. What are you talking about? You have your own series.
I want to know if I could fulfill these things, how the interaction is, I really want it to be pretty. That's the thing. Like my new book, I want it to be really pretty.
Yeah.
When I saw yours and I saw like the embossed and stuff, I was like, oh man, this is so cool. I want a really pretty book. So that's my goal. That's what I want.
Yeah.
You know, we have our goal. My goal is to have the end product look sexy.
I suspect that once you put any and all of your effort into that in earnest, it's going to be just fine. The thing that I'd come to find is that, you know, it's understanding what good looks like for you, right? And then be sort of like immovable in what that means. Like ultimately, like you can throw money at it. You know, you can throw like as much dollar symbols at it so it looks as good. But there's also, and here's for me, the quality was tempered by the business side, and that to me was the biggest piece of learning throughout this journey. You were asking earlier about like what were the things, your takeaways? What were some of the things that you had run into when you did this whole crowdfunding thing? And one of which was all of the stuff that happens behind the scenes, independent of the book, right? Wearing the different hats of what it means to not just draw it, not just write it, but also publish it. All of that pre-production pipeline and then the post-production pipeline, all of that I had to learn. And intimidating, but also exhilarating at the same time because I didn't know any of that, right? I wanted to find a relative freedom of what it means to be a creator in this space, not just as a self-publisher, but obviously like one of the people that I look up to is Jean Giraud, which is who's Moebius, right?
Mm-hmm.
I took a look at Moebius's career and all the things that he had done previous without the access to the kinds of resources that we have now, and what an amazing legacy he's left, but also a sort of potentially like a roadmap of how I want to proceed and conduct myself when it comes to my body of work and how it's being published and potentially how it could be perceived by the general audience, right? And so to me, that was the goal, was to get closer and closer to where Moebius is, which is like, hey, that guy can pretty much draw cowboys. That guy can pretty much draw, like he can pretty much draw a Western and sci-fi and superheroes and whatever. And it's not looked at as, oh, cool, look at that cool superhero punching another superhero. It's like, oh wow, Moebius has something to say about this story. It has something to say about this genre, and again, existing as an entity independent of a market, right? Of like back then the mainstream market was pretty much clear, So I'm trying to find my version of that with this venture.
Yeah, I'm on the same boat. That's what I want to.
Yeah.
So I'm going to mention Sergio Topi's one of those guys
Sure.
for me, and Moebius for sure is special because he did the artwork for The Alchemist, and I fell in love with that book, like everything about it, and it's special to me because my fiance gave it to me when we were friends on my birthday.
Right. Oh.
And it kind of represents like what we went through. We had this journey, and now we're here. Like we're here in Montana. It kind of started with that book, so it's special.
That's
and
so
I want
awesome.
people to have life experiences based around the art that I create, and and have meaning behind it. And so that, I think, to me, outside of the physical aspect of how the book looks, but I want to be able to create it like 100%, like understand it, and I feel like when you cook your meal, it's going to taste better than if you bought it.
Yeah.
Or someone made it for you.
I think
So
it's because you have insight on how that meal was cooked, and there's so much learning based off of that first one. The next time you prepare that same exact dish, you're like, oh, I remember that. Like I know when to do that or what ingredients to put. It's really, again, the part that kept me engaged was all the learning, and most importantly, like all the failings of it. I know that sounds funny, but every time I messed up, I was like, that sucks, and that was so expensive, to mess that up, right? Thankfully, there was a lot of patient people that were working behind the scenes with me. It's easy enough to point at me and point at that book and be like, oh, look how cool this looks, look how well made this looks. But there's like 5 or 6 different people involved in making sure that book looks as good and, most importantly, in your hands as it does,
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's a team effort. That's the thing with comic books, is you get the 1 or 2 people that get all the attention, and we know that everybody works really hard on it, but that's just kind of how it is. Some people represent the project as a whole, whether it's a movie or a comic book, but as long as and you're treating everybody as well as you can, that's kind of my takeaway from that. So
yeah, I try to. I try. I don't do it as well as I should. I don't do it as often as I should, but yeah, I try to.
You did say something important about enjoying your mistakes in a way. They say fail fast, fail hard, and fail often, which is true, because like if you don't enjoy that, or at least kind of nihilistic, but if you don't at least like have a takeaway, you're not going to get better, and you're not going to get to see that product you want. So I mean, like with you and I recording right now, like I hope it looks pretty good, and I think it'll work. I hope things don't die, but if it does, it's like, it's okay. It's part of the process, you know? It's okay not to be perfect, and you have to get over that hump. Even with art and writing, because, I'm not like writing 24/7, and I know you could attest to that. Like, we just do it anyways, and you learn, and there's so many resources out there to learn how to get better. You just have to take it seriously,
Yeah, I heard that part of your guys' conversation between you and Francis, and you guys were talking about like the books that you were reading that got you there. You mentioned Save the Cat, which is near and dear to me. Like, I love Save the Cat because it's so formulaic. I love it. And especially when it comes to like screenwriting. I think where Francis was coming from generally was more about like characterization, and less about like how a screenplay in a three act structure works, right? Which is where our Save the Cat is coming from. It is not to say that either his or Save the Cat was like the best way. What did you refer? Was it Sid Field, right?
Sid Field was his reference. We were talking about story, so that was Robert McKee was like our tie-in because we agree. But I went backwards. I did Save the Cat after Robert McKee, which I think might have been good for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think what's great about both of those books, especially in the order that you just mentioned, is like Robert McKee has a tendency to like have you understand things as holistically as possible. It's almost like going to from a generalist perspective in as far as like how to tell really, really good, really grounded, solid foundationally stories, characterization, their motivations. That's everything that I think you could possibly need, right? But then what Save the Cat does is points you towards a speciality, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like, how do you write? But then it goes right back into pointing you and like, okay, now talking about things in generality, here's what it means for you to do it in screenplay, right? And so I think that's one of the key things that in my opinion, I think that's a good order that you went down. But you guys were talking about it so seriously. You guys were like, "Oh, I understood." It gave me it unlocked my attitude towards like storytelling and then foundational and character and blah blah blah. And I was like, "Bro, I wish I took things that seriously." Like,
yeah, I know.
I wish I had that kind of approach.
I think it's because we wanted so badly to, dare I say this, legitimize our skills and to not even just prove it to ourselves, maybe, but. I don't know about you, man. When people say that something's really hard, guess what? I'm like, I want to see how hard it really is.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So, and so when people are like, oh, writing's hard. It's hard to break in. And I'm sure it is.
Yep.
That's why I want to do it.
Yep.
I don't want to do it because it's easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
I don't disagree. I mean, I don't want to say that writing isn't hard. It's definitely super challenging, but it's not like impossible. I think
because we do it all the time.
Yeah,
that's the one thing we do a lot.
Yeah, I think we take it for granted because it's inherently built into. It's a component that's built into our production, right? So we see it, right? And I'm like, oh, why is that so hard? But from somebody who's never seen a version of it, like somebody who's never seen a 3-act structure script before, I'm sure it's like alien space. I'm sure it's as foreign as anything. But I've seen it all my life, so I'm like, oh, that's how that works. That's what you do in Act 2. That's what you do in Act 3. That's how you. Like build character in with like a few words as opposed to like whole paragraphs, blah, blah, blah. Like, so for me, it wasn't, the challenge wasn't like I didn't know what it was. The challenge was like, just because I've seen it a bunch of times doesn't mean I can do it myself. So now I needed to understand why that worked, why that was so profound to me when I was reading it. So it became less about like the creative, and not to say that creative wasn't in there, it became less about the creative and more about the mechanical. Right, like I chuckle whenever I hear people refer to the beginning, the prologue to Up, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, it makes me cry so much," and blah blah blah. Right? I'm all like, yeah, because creatively there were a lot of things that they did in there that was like brilliant, but mechanically it was so obvious what they were doing. So like from a storytelling perspective, mechanically, it was like pretty straightforward. Creatively and how they executed that mechanism was brilliant, right? So those are the two things that I'm always like, and this is what my editor catches me on all the time, which is like, Eric, this is really mechanical. And I go, oh, okay. And then he goes back, and once we do the edit pass, he goes like, I think this is what you're trying to get at. He confirms, Joe confirms with me and goes like, I think this is what you're trying to get at, but you're doing it so mechanically, it's not going to land. And that is where an extra layer of challenge happens for me. And that's where I put that in the creative bucket, right? Where I'm like, oh, I understand what needs to happen mechanically, but creatively, I still need a lot more reps into this space. So if you see Arc Athena 1, and by the time we get to like Arc Athena 5, I'm like, oh, I get it. I'm getting it now. And Joe is like, I am having to just nudge you as opposed to like wholesale grab the steering wheel and like turn it away from you or like turn you in a direction. So I feel like I'm getting better at it. I'm still not, by no means an expert, but I'm getting a feel for it.
And I got lucky because I had plenty of writer friends to help me out with Lola. It wasn't like I was doing it all by myself, because by no means I had like 10 people tell me where to steer it, because they're like, you could draw this book, but we'll steer it for you.
Sure.
And the emotional aspect, because I didn't even have the mechanics behind me. I just had Francis and I, you know, what is it, young youthful bliss or ignorance?
Yeah, sure.
And
Sure.
you just go for it, and you kind of have
Yeah.
to, because you have to know where your blind spots are.
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely. I mean,
So-
that's the only way you can. I mean, everything is all about. I remember hanging out. This was decades ago, yeah, but like I was hanging out with a buddy of mine who worked in animation, and he was the guy who just really talked a really, really good game. You know, like he knew structure, he knew story, he knew like how to break it up specifically for comics, because comics is a different set of tumblers that need to fall into place for it to work out correctly. He just knew all of that. And when it came time to actually doing something about it, he was almost frozen in that knowledge. I know a handful of people in our industry who talk that really, really competent big game. But then if you ask them, okay, go and execute it, go and do something with that knowledge, they stop because they're paralyzed by all of it, because they go like, I know how to, it almost feels like, and this may not be 100% true for everyone, but they almost feel like now with all of this talk, I wonder if I can actually do it. As opposed to my attitude was like, I think I can talk that. So let me go figure out. And if I can't, I have enough confidence in myself to be able to recover and go do something about it then in the moment of, as opposed to from the beginning when there's nothing on paper, you know?
I'm with you. And that I think that's also what motivates me
Yeah.
right now is like, you're going to do all this talking. You better go figure some stuff out.
Yeah, man. Yeah, there's that, and then just currently where I see, you know, an industry that I was once really, really 100% in love. I'm 1,000% in love with, and I'd realized I'm not as in love with it. This happened in the past, right? Where I'm like, I left comics to go into animation, started reading comics while I was in animation, and started getting this feeling of like, it has to change, right? That it had to evolve into the kind of stories that were being told. And so I fell out of it again because I was like, oh, those aren't the kind of stories that I want to read, or at least it's not with the stories that I was familiar with. And then finally coming back to it years after that and going like, it's completely transformed into not the thing. Not only did I not want to read it, but I didn't think it was accurate and appropriate for the kind of stories that needed to be told with those kinds of comics. Now, bear in mind, I'm by no means the authority. I just know what I like, and I felt like, hey, there's a way that you should be telling Mickey Mouse stories, right? Like, there's no reason to do these kinds of stories, especially with that brand, especially with those characters. And I didn't quite understand why it had transformed into what it turned into. But then I saw that as opportunity, right? I saw that as like, oh, they don't want to tell that story anymore. And so the further I looked, I'm like, oh, it's not really those kinds of stories aren't being told. I don't know why. I didn't want to understand why, the reasoning. I wanted to be like, well, if it's not, they're not going to tell it. I'll do it. You know, I love telling those stories. I love those kinds of stories. I suspect there's a lot of people, young and old, who love those kinds of stories, and I'll go tell it, you know?
Yeah. I think that's what I want too. Obviously, I have my own perspective on it, and we love comic books as a medium and the way that stories are being told. And if there's not enough of a certain story and you feel this obligation to tell that story, then go tell that story, because that's one. If you don't tell that story, it's one less person trying to pursue it, as hard as it may be, because it's easy to go down that path that everybody wants to take. You know, it's the romanticism of the idea of being in comic books.
For sure.
And the less romantic side is the side that kind of gets me going. And I want to publish books that tell those other types of stories, like Moebius, for example, that kind of thing, where you feel like it could stand alone, and years from now when things change, that story is always going to be told the way that you wanted to tell it, instead of like, oh, I had like 100 people behind me, this is what they wanted.
Right.
Like I can't live with myself as an artist if I at least didn't try.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, so
I use Moebius as an example based on the body of work that he's produced, and obviously have a profound impact on me as an artist. And yet the story that I tell with Arcathena is like superheroes. It doesn't delegitimize my admiration. It just for me, it just says like, this is the thing that I'm really super passionate about. And I think if there's a spirit, if there's a takeaway from that Moebius example, is that, you know, he was passionate about telling those kinds of stories. It just happens to be in my case, it's a bunch of dudes flying around and shooting lasers out of their hands, you know. But it's like, it doesn't make it any less compelling, you know, as an exercise for me. One day I could potentially do the sci-fi story that Moebius did with like Airtight Garage or whatever, but it's like, that's not right now for me.
Exactly. So hopefully we cycle through our ideas and just put them out as
I hope
much
so.
as possible. Because yeah, I know you're like, I only have 2 ideas left on. I have this many years. Like, how do I get those ideas out before, I can't do it anymore? So
Yeah, no, I hope
it's
so.
in the back of my mind. Like, I want to get through this. I want to go do that. But I mean, if you think about George Lucas, how many properties did he really work on in his lifetime and body of work?
Right.
Maybe 2, 3 that you could remember.
Yeah.
There's some people, yeah, I guess that's how it is, right? Like Tarantino's got how many movies now?
Yeah. Like a lot. And I mean,
A lot. Yeah,
the guy
it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, the guy clearly has a lot of stories to tell, and I love that fact. Somebody says it could be argued that, based on your example, that Tarantino is more prolific than George Lucas based on the IP and the property count. But I think once you find that thing that you're really, really good at, right, and especially if you have more things to say about that thing, then go do it. I think if pointing at Lucas and you say like, oh, it's Star Wars, right? He's known for that thing, and he's obviously made his legacy and fortune based on that thing. Seemingly, he had a lot to say about that, so he continued down that path, right? I think if you take 2 steps back with Tarantino, he just likes to tell stories, right? He just likes making movies, and he's such a big nerd for the kinds of movies that he makes that he likes taking on those different kinds of challenges. But inherently, those movies have his sort of fingerprints all over it, right? It's his way of telling those kinds of stories. Both of those things are legitimate. One of which is like IP franchise, and it stands up theme parks,
I guess the bottom line is, what is your goal?
Yep.
What is your dream?
Yep.
And you can't compare the two. I mean, it's to each their own,
Yep.
But as artists, we have to chase who we are.
Yep.
I know we hear that a lot, but it's true. You got to chase who you are, or else you're not going to be happy in whatever suit you put yourself in.
Absolutely. And just keep in mind that
position.
There's 2 things that I've come to learn about myself is that, who I am, who I was 10 years ago, who I was 20 years ago, completely, I think it's transformed to who I am today. But it does not mean that the goals that I set for myself back then are no longer viable, right? Especially if I manage to check it off of my list. It is to say that, if you were to really bear down on that statement that you said, which is like, you have to understand who you are. That's sometimes you transform really dramatically, right? But it does not. One of the key things that I wanted for myself was like the execution and delivery. I was never able to do that as well because I kept changing sort of the goals, right? Like I should have. I think I remember when Kingdom Come came out for the first time, and I saw the Alex Ross and Mark Waid book, and I thought like, I hope one day I get to do this book. I hope one day I get to do something like this, where I feel like as good as Dark Knight was and as good as Watchmen was for me when I held Kingdom Come, I was like, what an amazing experience. Because unlike Dark Knight, unlike Watchmen, again, which was of an era and I believe to be appropriate, was like, it was so dour. It was so dark, right? When Kingdom Come came out, it spoke against that. Well, it spoke to that, but also like presented something else, which inherently, when it comes to like superhero comics, I think that needed to be, that was such a great, refreshing statement to say, right? Like where you can go from this really super dark, pessimistic place, find yourself again and find a new thing that you represent externally, but still internally represents you well. And that's what Kingdom Come, like as I read it, I was like, wow, this felt so good by the end, And I think that's why, as an exercise or like as a feat, when I see Dark Knight, I was like, geez, Louise, this is just unbelievable, the thing that they did with this and how appropriate it was for its time. But what Kingdom Come did was like take the baton from Dark Knight and brought it back up again towards, deconstructing superheroes into like turning superheroes into like aspirational concepts again,
Yeah.
And so for me, that's what I wanted to do. And I never had the tenacity to go and execute it or just the overall experience. I was always just like too young and too dumb and was focused on the things that allowed me to survive back then. Right. But these days I'm like, I want to do superhero stuff again. And I want you to understand that, unlike Kingdom Come, who are like, had people, heroes as proxies of ideas, which I really, really loved, but I don't quite understand how to do it very well. I don't have enough experience as a writer and as a creator. What I did was like, I think I understand X-Men really, really well because I understand them as people first, right? And that gave me a better handle on like how to write superhero story, because it's just like people trying to do aspirational things knowing full well that they can't be as aspirational as everybody wants them to be or will let them be. Right?
I guess that's a good starting point for everybody, is to start with looking at them as people and human, and then putting yourself in that place. Hopefully that will get you something at least genuine if you're going to write something, you know, as best as you can. And now that we're older, you look at it as a whole, whereas when you're younger, you're starting out with anybody or anything, you look at it very narrowly, whatever your narrow focus is. And as we get older, everything gets broader and more, I don't know what you would call it, where it's like, oh, I see everything, you know, and I understand everything. Not everybody's bad.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a better, like, you know, this is going into the technical, going into the mechanical part of storytelling. And I remember not quite understanding why, you know, a cast, like, you know, an ensemble cast worked really, really well. I mean, this is not just exclusive to comics. You can see it in movies as well, right? And I remember when going through the exercise of like, why does that work so well by the end of the story? And it was because, and in part, not in whole, but it's like you present the thesis of what you're trying to get at with your characters up front. You have one main, your protagonist conceptually, that's the lantern, that's the load that they bear, is that thesis of like, what does this mean to them, you know? And then you surround them with people who either mirror what they're saying, partially reflect what they're saying, or people who are counter to what they're saying, right? In that small ensemble cast, everything makes sense. And I realized, like, wait a second, in any, like, you know, I've worked on many productions for animation. We're all moving towards this goal that is like getting whatever, the Batman, Superman, whatever, Justice League cartoon out the door, right? But within the context of that production, everybody had their opinion about how to get that thing out the door as good looking as it needs to be, right? And I think within Arcathena and like any ensemble book, it's like especially the X-Men, you know, like all those characters were all moving towards a goal, but they're all moving towards a goal based on their different personalities and outlook. And as soon as I understood that, put the thesis up front, right? Have whomever it is say what the point of it all is. And so that your audience, as they're reading along, goes like, oh, I get it. You know, this is very mechanical. Like, yeah, I get what the point of this story is. Here's the person that's saying it. And by the end, to me anyway, that's how you arc them, you know, which is like, here's how I started. Here was the thesis. The thesis is still true by the end, right? But the way by which I approach that thesis is completely different now, or has transformed, or has like changed a little bit. It still doesn't make the thing that I said untrue. It just makes it so that my growth, this adventure, this sort of like journey from like book 1 to book 6, I've changed in my outlook on how to get there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I it's, you say it sounds mechanical, but to me, I think when I'm thinking about it, it's like you can't not think about it mechanically in a way.
Sure. Sure.
Because if you stick too much with the ebb and flows of emotion and how to drive something narratively, you want people to relate, like Save the Cat, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to realize that you have to get from point A to point B, or else. And then I think when you're writing characters too, you have to almost understand. You have to the very first thing is understand their motives.
Yep.
And when people start writing, maybe it's, I don't know about you, or where you start with your characters, but do you start with their personality, or do you start with what they want? Usually it's not what they want right away. It's always like they embody a certain personality type before you even have like a want for them in a way. See, because I was like that for a while, and even when I'm thinking about my stories now, it's like, what do they really want, and why do they want it so bad? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when I was a younger writer and artist, like I didn't really think that way. Like, yeah. It's mechanical.
Yeah,
you know, too.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, but by no means is it, you know, like unimportant. You know, like
it's very important.
I think one of the key things that people really glom onto is understanding what you want. You know, I think in the instances in by which I'm having to deal with people now in real life, especially at my job, whenever it's talking about like, hey, here's our goal with this exercise, with this particular piece of art, with this particular piece of narrative, and then like there is a goal, right? There's a thing that we have to go and deliver. So that's the want, right? I want to go deliver that goal, but there's a group of people who want to help push that thing all the way to the finish line, right? Who also have that same goal, but they have different personalities. So I think that's what informs the conflict, right? That's what informs like, and by the way, it doesn't necessarily even have to be an antagonist, right? Which I think people, when Joe and I were talking about the story for Arc Athena, the antagonist is great because she's so bombastic, because she's so almost like operatic in her like conduct and the way she just like blows up people. Your classic, evil mustache twirling villain, and people will look at the antagonist in Arc Athena and just be like, oh, you're just your typical bad guy. That's the point of her, is the being that typical bad guy. It doesn't have to be Thanos all the time, where everything makes sense and ultra motivated for that villain, and that's great and everything, and maybe I'll get there someday, as far as my skill set is concerned. But really, I'm using that antagonist as a mechanism to help reflect back to my protagonist, to be like, these are your goals, and here's another person preventing you from getting those goals, right?
That's true. And I think if you do it that way, or you use that as that mechanism to deliver the story and your main character and have them grow, that there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's why some movies, even if their antagonist is stereotypical per se, it still works. It still works because it also challenges the protagonist in different ways, and there's more than one way to get to that, to have them grow as the main character. So
I love obvious bad guys. I love, like, that's clearly the bad guy. I don't like looking at
because sometimes you get a little too cute with the bad guys, and you're like, there's no way that's because you try to switch them on a dime. Like, there's no way that person went from that to that.
Yeah, no, I
don't want. Am I allowed to bring it up, Game of Thrones, or is that not good?
No, this is your show, lady. Let's bring up Game of Thrones.
Yeah, so that's one thing. It's like, I get it, and I don't care. Like, I get that maybe she'll turn into the bad guy at some point, but I felt like it was rushing her degeneration too quickly, and I just couldn't buy it like as I wanted to, but it just wasn't. There was something missing. Even if you added 5 minutes, maybe, but there was nothing.
Yeah, I don't think people were wrong when they said like, hey, there were pieces in place that led her to that space, right? But I think there's a whole lot of things that probably helped to inform that decision to do it that quickly. Not the least of which, right? They were probably running up against that end of the season. They didn't like. I don't know. I'm not in those productions. I can't begin to tell. If you were to ask me what my gut was, which is like, that was a heel turn that happened so quick, it almost broke my neck. It's like, I know there were pieces in there that did inform why she did the things that she did, but I felt like, and I'm not in those spaces. I'm not in that production, so I'm armchair quarterbacking, but I'm like, you could have laid that down so much better than what ended up than the final execution. But
and I that's the reality of being an artist too, and doing it for work. You have, like you said, the printing and the business side of it that we neglect a lot of times. Yeah. And I think if we go into it knowing ahead of time, at least it'll mitigate some of the problems that we end up with in the in the future. And so even with my own stuff now, I try to look at the business side of things before I walk into something thinking it's just going to be a certain way, because you may not get that extra season, the extra volume, that extra page that you want. Sure. And even with my story right now with Neo Wonderland, I wrote 32 pages of story, but the reality is when I crowdfund it, maybe I'm only going to be able to get 24 pages of story in, or 20 pages of story in. So I have to break the last few pages into a way that it doesn't look unnatural.
Yeah. Wait, so what's informing 32 versus 24 based on crowdfunding effort? What's like
just to get it printed in a certain quality and just stuff like that. I'm not even completely sure yet, but I need to talk to some people who could figure out the numbers and the shipments and stuff out.
I don't know how much research that you've done, but please do not hesitate to use me as a resource. I'm happy to give you as much of this information as I possibly can, in as far as like what is the most cost, like it was always in the back of my mind, like cost effectiveness of getting stuff out the door. One of the things that I knew for sure was going to be cost prohibitive, not necessarily by way of um, not necessarily by way of like paying for the printing, but primarily from people's perspective who have gotten used to paying X amount of dollars for a book, right? And I'm asking you to pay $25 for it. That was an insane ask. If I step back and think about it, like people are already griping at $7, $6, and I'm saying, hey, buy this at 25. That was, you want to talk about like barrier to entry. That was it. People were not going to give me any, they were not going to give me any leeway to try to charge them $25 per book. So immediately that cut people out of the way. But for me, one of the things was like, I had to come to terms with the fact that it was just not going to be immediately accessible to people. What I'm hoping for, right? And this is like the hope of hopes, is that, and this compounds with the idea that there were so many crowdfunding projects out there that didn't fulfill, that were not made to be long-term, that were not made to be like a series. I think mine was one of the first where I promised it right out the gate. The first book is not going to end and then suddenly be like, oh, a potential second and third and fourth book. No, this is like a mini series, right? So the first book is going to end, going to lead right into the second, so on and so forth. And it's not going to end until the sixth, right? So like what my hope was that I earn the trust, and by giving you a consistent, high quality, not just in like actual product, but the story that you're on, right? Like I give you that level of high quality that the $25 suddenly potentially becomes feasible as an investment for you. Because not only are you like, I would love to be able to help Eric out because he's a creator that I believe in, but I also am really invested in this series. I'm really invested in these characters. So I didn't have any sort of like misconceptions about, hey, I'm going to basically cut these certain demographic off because they're not willing to spend $25. What I'm hoping for is that through word of mouth, and it's slowly happening, people are like, holy crap, when is this third book going to come out? Right? Because I'm already into books and I'm into it really, really bad. When is it? And they're already telling their friends about it and so on and so forth. So
I think that's exactly how I look at Kickstarter or crowdfunding, because I do want to end up publishing books, and I want to be a mainstay and claw my way up to a certain place where it's consistent. Because I mean, fans follow us around for years, dude, decades even. Yep. And I love them so much. I know a lot of them by name because I respond as much as possible. The idea of like not giving them something that they waited a long time for, or that they spent all their money and they work really hard to get,
For sure. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I'd come to find more than anything that I could do, or maybe that runs in parallel into my efforts, because I was talking to my buddy offline, like just as recently as yesterday. And for the next 2 years or so, maybe as many as 3, I'm in an awareness campaign. Not just in a crowdfunding sense, not just in the publishing and printing sense. I'm in an awareness campaign that I want to cement it in your head that, number one, I'm serious about this space. I'm serious about delivering a mini series to you, and that I believe in I believe in the characters, I believe in the story, and that I believe in the IP. So and I think that takes like really hardcore dedication. You need to I need to convince people that I'm not just like, hey, I did my 3 books and thank you very much, and maybe I'll go back and do something else. No, I'm going to keep doing this, right? And that to me is like, that's potentially is the fork in the road, right? Which is like, I use Moebius as an example. Moebius had done like 3 or 4 different amazing sort of worlds that we can point out really easily. But once I established within 3 years that, hey, Arc Athena is the thing that I'm going to be working on, that's the fork in the road, which is like, do I want to go and do a Western, or do I want to do like Arc Athena 2, Yeah. So that's a good problem to solve, right? Like it's a good problem to be in.
It's a great problem, and you have to have the mindset of thinking way ahead and long term. That's why Robert Kirkman, like, The Walking Dead, as long as he did it. Sure. And even though he found all the success with the shows, he just kept going, and it's very admirable, you know? And even Todd McFarlane. So a lot of these people who are doing that right now, the fact that they just kept going, and just there's something to say about that. Because people are going to look back. There's a back catalog of stuff, and that's what I want for myself as a creator, that legacy.
Absolutely.
And people appreciate that. Yeah.
I want to be able to look back and be like, oh, there's 6 or 7 volumes of this thing, But also, I want to be like, hey, I want to go I want to tell an astronaut story, like, I don't know, I'll
Yeah.
find it. What's great, and this goes back to your point, which is like, once you have those fans that are dedicated to not just the stories that you're telling, but obviously you as a creator, right? Man, oh man, they do so much apostolizing for you. They're the ones that go out and say, hey, have you read Walking Dead? Like, yo, have you read, Invincible? Have you read Spawn? Have you, like, all to your examples, like, and they're the ones that convince their friends to go buy it, right? And it's through that sort of like, I'll take that word of mouth advertising any day of the week. It'd be amazing if it goes and explodes and turns into something else, but I want those hardcore people who are like, I remember the first review that I got for Arc Athena, and they went and, actually, I remember 2. I'll give you 2 examples. One was this guy, and he was flipping through every page, and he was pointing out key panels in the page, and he was like, I hope that Eric does more with this character. Like, I hope he does more because I really love this character. I really love potentially the backstory and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, holy crap. I was so involved on the mechanical like the different hats that I was wearing in order to get the book out. I don't look at it, at least not, I didn't used to. I didn't look at it from the fans' perspective of them seeing it the same way that I would see characters back when I would read books, right? I was like, holy cow, that guy is into this book, which was really endearing, which is really heartwarming. The other one was, and it was a weird, I guess he had a YouTube channel, and he would put like different denominations of money throughout Arc Athena 2 or Arc Athena 1. And he said, like, here's the $1 page where he, like, this is really cool. And it just escalated, from like $1 all the way to the $100 bill. And he's like, here's the $100 page. And he opens to the book and he's like, I love this page because. Now, what he ended up loving it for, really awesome. But the fact that he loved it made me go like, oh, crap. And so to my point is like, I want those people. I want those fans. I want those readers who are like clamoring for the next book.
That's awesome. That's kind of like I just get goosebumps thinking about the fact that people do that, and we are fans. And I feel like I've lost that fan feeling of things because we know how these sausages made, so it's kind of hard.
That's it. Yep, that's it. Yeah, my wife is exactly the same thing. Where it's hard for us to watch movies because she's like, why did they pick that shot? She's a storyboard artist by trade, right, an illustrator by by choice, but she's like, so weird why they would pick that shot over this shot when you watch. And so it's great when something like that happens, when fans look at it from that perspective, and it reminds you what it was like to be a fan when I first saw a Mark Silvestri anything. I was like, holy cow, this guy can really freaking draw, or a Jim Lee anything, or like a John Byrne anything, or a Paul Smith anything, where I was like, wow, man, this is so much fun. What does next month look like? And I think beyond the fan base that I'm hoping to establish within the next 3 years, again, in this 3-year awareness campaign for myself as a creator, for my series in general, what I'm hoping to find is getting people into that space that they're not used to because current comics isn't offering it up anymore.
Now I want to hear you talk more about these artists that we grew up loving, because even though I see how the sausage is made, those artists that made me tick, they still make me tick. Like, I still love their stuff.
I love those. I love that. On my bedside is the first volume of Akira, and that's not, I know that sounds ultra pretentious.
I have one too, though. I mean, that's the thing. I have that one.
It sits by my bedside, and it's a reminder, potentially, of like, that's the goal. To go and not necessarily do Akira, but to be so into a thing that you're doing that you can do like volumes of it, and but then also it's a sobering metric. Like I opened that book and I'm like, geez, this guy drew everything, and he just, I mean, I suspect that I've heard that there's like assistants involved or whatever, but hardly the point. The point is like they do these books, right, in such a way that there was no promise of anything else at the other end, not movies, not animation, not like merchandise, not like whatever fame, none of that. It was just like, I want to tell this story. I want to draw, and the way that I tell this story is through drawing it, right? And I'd forgotten that. I'd forgotten that love for like, hey, I want to do panel to panel drawings that like that feel and that are just as awesome as these people that I just mentioned earlier. You know, when I first saw, I didn't have an appreciation for Paul Smith in the beginning, who's the artist for Uncanny X-Men. I'd liked it, but then I came off of like John Byrne, you know, which is like detailed and rendered and whatever else, you know. And then Paul Smith comes in and like simplifies everything, and I didn't quite understand how brilliant that was. He was able to like distill it, but also purely from a functional, pragmatic perspective. I remember him reading this one interview where it's like, I needed to do that style because he wanted to draw like Alex Raymond, who was ultra like rendery and feathering and whatever. And on a monthly schedule of X-Men, he couldn't do that. So he had to find a style that helped facilitate a monthly schedule, but also still, you know, retained his interest enough to be able to do it month in, month out. Because back then you graduated to the X-Men, you know, like that was the book that everybody wanted to be in, because that was the book that was like really, if you were somebody of note within the Marvel bullpen, that's the book that they gave you as a thank you so much. You're amazing. Here's X-Men for you. So he wanted to stay on that book, but he had to find a style so that he could do it month in and month out. And in finding that style, that's when I was like, holy crap, how good is this guy? It's not overburdened with like rendering and hatching and all that kind of stuff. It was just like strong poses, clear storytelling, right? Clear characterization and clear acting, right? That's something that not many people know how to do, is like to make their characters act and land the emotional space in visual form, minus the bubble over their head. Like you can understand what they're feeling and what they're emoting. Paul Smith landed that, and he didn't hide behind rendering. So from there, it just like ramped up into like a lot of education for me. So I remember picking up, you know, again, like just picking up John Romita Jr. when he was on X-Men, and then you know, but the occasional smattering of like Art Adams, and then you get into Mark Silvestri's run, and I didn't understand it all of it, but I knew that they were X-Men. You know, like I knew this was cool X-Men stuff. But what Mark Silvestri brought into it was all the dynamic things that helped inform him. I don't know if I can recall an interview that he did that helped inform his style, but then it just fit the stories that they were trying to tell. I told this story before, where they did Fall of the Mutants, and all of them kind of sacrificed themselves in order for the world to survive against this impending doom that Forge unleashed on the world when he was in Vietnam and trying to like get retribution for the fallen soldiers that were in his company. But like, I remember them sacrificing themselves in order to close this gate so that the demons can be caught behind it, like just bawling, just like crying my eyes out. And my mother walks in, and typical Filipino mom, she never even asked, what's wrong? Are you hurt? Blah, blah, blah. She's just like, who died? You know, she goes like, who died? And I said, the X-Men, you know, like sobbing, you know, and like the X-Men. And she was so annoyed by the idea that it was like comic book characters. She was like, get out of here, go play, or something like that. She was so dismissive about the whole thing. But I just remember like having such an attachment, and this goes back to my story earlier about this guy who was going over my book, having such an attachment from John Byrne to Paul Smith to John Romita Jr. on all the way to Mark Silvestri, and they paid off Fall of the Mutants for the first time, or they paid off Fall of the Mutants. And just thinking to myself like, wow, this is really powerful. And to somebody who's reading Arc Athena at the beginning of it, you know, having those characters be like, I really, really love that character. That's my point of reference. To be like, I want that for them the same way Mark Silvestri and obviously Chris Claremont, who wrote that series leading up to Fall of the Mutants. Like, I want that I want to become that level of not just the fan base, obviously the readership, but that level of sophisticated writing where I can compel that kind of, oh mom, the X-Men died, you know, kind of, you know, impact as it was to me as a kid, right?
Yeah.
I that's one of my
How old
goals.
were you when that happened?
Oh gosh, embarrassingly too old to be weeping over X-Men comics, you know, but certainly I did, and I'm not embarrassed that it happened. It just goes to, I'm partially embarrassed that it happens, but it just goes to show how well the story was laid out in front of me. We were talking earlier about like, you know, how sort of like seemingly the heel turn in Game of Thrones didn't work. It's different, obviously, comics and television series, but I think like you build that into your characters. And I think that's the reason why people reacted so allergically to Game of Thrones, because you had spent so much time building that character, and for them to do that almost at a drop of a dime, I'm like, in a pit, like it just seemed weird and off-putting. Whereas in X-Men, it was like, wow, they built that. They built all of those characters. You understood why they were making the decisions that they were doing. And at the end of the day, I go back to my point of reference for Kingdom Come. Those are the aspirational heroes that I was drawn to. It was like they acted like people, but at the end of the day, they knew they had to go do this thing that was beyond
The best
them,
of us.
right?
They acted like people with
yeah.
the best of humanity and our species.
Oh yeah, yeah, and they're all flawed. All the X-Men were jacked up. They all had like issues with each other, issues with their outlook, issues with like their personal conduct or whatever it is. They understood how flawed they were. But at the end of the day, they still tried to rise up to the better versions of themselves, and that's pretty freaking awesome.
That's beautiful. No, you're making me... I almost cried a couple of times we're talking about this, which is weird.
Yeah.
But I feel that passion again. Like, I felt like I was in a vacuum making my own comic book because... or writing New Wonderland, because, like, I've had the story for 20 years, and I haven't really bounced the emotion and feeling and the ideas off of anybody else, especially somebody in the field or comics. And so just being able to talk to you right now, I would have talked to you regardless of if we had cameras on or not about this, because like
sure,
this is going to be a long journey. So to not be passionate about it, or at least know where you're going, and to feel like there's a reason for it, especially at our age.
Excuse me.
What was that?
I said I'm gonna sneeze. So if you see me sneeze, that's me. Keep talking.
I want you
I'm
to
listening.
sneeze
I promise.
So it's not going to happen. But, just I would gladly talk to you about this, because I really want something more for the industry as a whole, because I, just like you, I remembered what it felt like. It's magical. And I want it to feel like magic again. Even at my age, I want it to feel like magic, and I don't see why it can't feel like magic. Like Quentin Tarantino, when he talks about films, the guy is still like just giggling and talking about stuff, and just very animated, and he's so happy to do it. So regardless of where things go, he still kind of doesn't let that affect him as a creator, and I take that with me. And it was really nice to be able to kind of bounce this off of you, and then everybody else gets to hear our conversation too, because like it's important, I feel like, to remember why we do this in the first place. And
I mean there is a level of cynicism inside of me that prevents me from going into the space that you're going into right now. And I think it's more of a what would you call, like a survival mechanism for me. Like whenever I start thinking about like the industry could use a bit more optimism, the industry could use the thing that you're talking about, like, offering up everything that you're talking about. That to me is like amazing. It's daunting for me to like, use myself as a character in that story, right? Like, I don't think of it that way. I find value in what you and I are doing right now, which is like talking and understanding. We have a level of like synchronicity and like-mindedness. I love that. I love finding those people. And it's not to say that I don't believe in. Well, actually, I was about to say, it's like, it's not that I don't believe in the industry. I totally don't. Like, I don't care about it. I don't care. I love comics, right? I love making them. I found a new dedication to it recently, especially with this book, because I had grown cynical about the industry and compounded comics with it, right? And that was really unfair, because I don't think it's not one, or it's not both, right? It's not always coupled with each other. The industry can do whatever the heck it does, but it does not make comics any less
exactly
magical,
that's
right?
what I'm thinking.
So I'd rather not think about like, hey, how do I reintroduce this thing into this industry? I would rather look at it from like, what is the thing that I feel like I'm not getting anymore? Right? Or feel like some people are not, I feel like there's an opportunity space here for me to tell this story to like-minded people who are like really open and enthusiastic about it, right? Let me go talk to those people, because the moment I broaden it out and be like, a moment that I open the paddock and be like, what's outside of this arm's reach thing that I'm trying to do, it becomes really daunting and I start to get pessimistic. But when I have conversations like this with you, right, and other individuals who are like, I'm just enthusiastic about making this thing. Like one of the guys, like Jim Mahfood. Jim does not like take the comics industry into account at all because Jim has been hustling independent of the comic book industry. That he just continues to make comics. And I see his sort of like long-term tenacity, right? And I'm like, holy crap, Jim, how do you do it? And inherently, my takeaway every time that we talk is the guy he just loves drawing. And he just loves drawing like panel to panel stuff, book to book. You know, he doesn't think of it in the context of like, well, how does it fit into the grander scheme of like, how does my work look? And you know, it's probably not very whatever mainstream, like what he doesn't care about that. He's just like, I have this story to tell. I love telling it, right? I'm going to go find a way to get it out to people. And at its core, I want him to bottle that and sell it to me, right? Because there are times when I look externally, especially because we have access. The thing is, Jim has access to the same social media. He just doesn't let it impact him all that much. Like, that's cool, but that's over there, right? Mm-hmm. I look at it as like, you know, I have a tendency to look at stuff and I'm like, that really sucked. And I get angry and annoyed and I realize I only have so much energy during my day. I need to find and build this muscle that like allows me to like, that's funny, but that's over there, as Jim does, you know? Yeah. And I'm reminded by, you know, Scotty Young. Mm-hmm. Like Scotty was talking on social media the other day. He was talking on Twitter where he's like, he used to love people's blogs and Blogger because he would get this hint of people's processes and then ultimately see the art as it has, like, you know, as it's being presented. Whereas social media makes things almost immediately forgettable. Mm-hmm. You know, you're like, hey, you present it and it goes up in a timeline and it's gone. Whereas Blogger, you'd have an opportunity to just sit there and really sort of, you know, digest that thing, especially if you're in a journey of learning, right? And so I remember that too. And I was like, that's not romanticized. That's not like, oh, everything in Blogger was amazing and flowery and beautiful and it smelled great. It was like, that actually did exist. That was a thing. That was not that long ago. And that goes back to the other part. That goes back to the beginning part, what I said with Jim, which is like, this guy just loves putting out stories. And he doesn't care in the context and how it fits. He just knows that it fits for him. And if I can find a way to develop those barriers, right, to not like, that's over there. I don't care. I'm slowly getting there. Like I'm slowly and people are like, you don't give a shit. I'm like, you kind of have to not, because this thing that you're doing is so much more important than the external stuff that doesn't impact you all that much. Because you and I are building within a system that we've established for ourselves. There's similarities there, but it's unique to you. There's certain nuances of it that's unique to you, and it's unique to me. But at the end of the day, we believe in the thing that we are doing independent of that construct, which is like mainstream and how we get written up by like whatever the media is, blah, blah, blah. It's like, we can do this on our own. We'll do it on independent of that.
Long-term thinking again. Yep. Long-term thinking, happiness. And I think if you have that going for you, all the other stuff doesn't seem to matter as much, you know?
Yeah. Although some could argue that it would, and there's validity to what they're talking about. Like, how do you use social media as a tool? And it's not a very optimal tool to use. And
it changes so quickly. Right? It's on a whim of like an algorithm. Yeah. You can't really put your whole life on that. And I've seen it firsthand, you know, how bad that gets for everybody, you know. So I just don't want that to control the way I do things, because you have to live with yourself every day and what you do.
For sure. Yeah. I remember kind of looking at it quizzically when it first happened, and only recently, well, not recently, but only like after a month or so afterwards, I was like, Mark, you brilliant piece of shit. There, you know, there's a friend of mine, writer Mark Millar. He said, I'm not going to do social media by way of the way you see it now. Like, I'm going to do everything through my .com, and I'm going to release everything the way I want it. And I'm all like, I guess so. You know, let's see how that works. And I'd forgotten that he's like Mark Millar, the Mark Millar. And then also that I understood the exercise. I understood that he wanted to take things out of an ecosystem that wasn't very conducive to people understanding the things that he wants them to pay attention to, right? He wanted to take the short-term attention that is embedded into social media, which you're talking about, like it's algorithmically based. It doesn't really stick around for very long. And he wants you to bring you into an ecosystem that's just all about the things that he wants you to focus on, which is like onto his website and onto his like, whatever. Like even Substack generally is like, it's trying to do that, right? But it doesn't capture it perfectly. I think what he's trying to do is by bringing it onto his .com, he was like, I think here it's potentially like I can control this environment, right? You're here and you are paying attention to the things that I want you to pay attention to, as opposed to me having to compete with however many thousands of people that you're following, right? And the people who are those people are retweeting the people that they're following and so on and so forth, right? And so I think that's really, really smart. And I think I'm going like at beginning of 2023, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. Like, how do I bring you, even if I still use Twitter, how do I say, hey, see this part of this thing that you're taking a look at that you're super excited by, incentivize your attention and go capture it elsewhere. Again, in an ecosystem that's under almost exclusively the thing that I want you to pay attention to as opposed to everything else. I think that's a worthwhile thing. And that goes back to what I was talking about with Scotty when he was like, I remember blogs. And I was like, yes, one of the really amazing things about that is like you went to somebody else's space and say, hey, let me learn about the things that you're into. Let me learn about this thing that you want me to pay attention to. Like right now, you're in a room screaming at the top of your lungs, right? Some more effectively than others, right? Depending on how amazing that product is, or by way of legacy, right? They have your attention because they have a gazillion people following them. Like you're screaming in a room full of people, and you're like, I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
That's not a good way of getting your attention. I'm going to go someplace else. And hopefully I bring you along.
It's funny, you and I made the same revelation at the same time because I started writing articles on my official site. Because of the conversations we're having, I'm able to get more resources together to add to the website. So there's things like there's like certain types of videos I want to make that I wouldn't want to put on YouTube, but I'd love to do like video essays on my official site. So there's always going to be extra content somewhere else. And I feel like it's worthwhile to do that instead of having random videos on YouTube where they have certain expectations. On my website, it's everything I want it to be, and I want to keep it that way. So I'm on the same boat as you. I think we are synchronized in some weird way.
Yeah, we are drift compatible in that way. I think that also, if you take a step back, and I'm not really a huge fan of this kind of talk, but I understand the value of it, right? So I have to incorporate it into my vernacular, which is like you have to start thinking of yourself as a creator and as a brand, and it's like, how do you want people to perceive you moving forward? And that's the business hat that I wasn't really like as artists, as illustrators, as creative people. We don't often put those hats on, and it's so weird that we don't. It's not in our sort of like training, but how critical it is for somebody moving forward, right? Like at one point everybody is so art centric and craft focused. But then somebody goes like, well, here's a contract. Go take a look at that. And then you're like, I don't have the capacity to even understand where the pitfalls are in that contract. I'm just signing because I'm so excited to be drawing X, or I'm drawing something for myself, and this company is interested enough in investing in me so that I can continue to draw that thing, but not realizing, oh, that's really disadvantageous to me in the back end, So all of these businessy things of how to handle yourself as an entity independent of your art, but obviously incorporated into it. Like I wish somebody taught me that, but I'm so much more attuned and focused on that stuff. Like I hear people all the time online, and there's this guy that I listen to. His name is Perch. Perch is amazing. He's like, for creators to just sign over contracts. They're like what is the one thing I don't know how he was positioned or like posed to him, like, what are the key things as an illustrator, as a creative in the field? One of the key things that I should invest in. And the first thing that he said was like, invest in a good lawyer.
Yeah.
And in your head, when you hear that, you're like, my expectation at that age, at that phase in my life, I'd have been like a Cintiq, like, a really good computer, or like, get good business sense, get in good business relationship with a printer, blah, blah, blah. And while all of those are really, really important, one of the key things, especially once you start moving into, and it won't resonate with people won't pick up on that signal because they're not in that proper space yet. You have to be in a phase in your career where you're like, I need to invest in myself. And one of those investments are people who are invested in me, in the business of making sure that my creative health is at its highest, right? And a good attorney is who has your back, understanding, nope, we're going to redline the heck out of that.
An attorney and an accountant.
Oh yeah, having those two components in place as a business, as a person who's thinking just beyond just the craft, I that's so invaluable. And the moment I had one in my corner, I was like, holy crap, how important, like how amazing is this experience, right? It was taxing because it was a space that I wasn't used to. If you were to ask me to draw like a bunch of stuff, I'm happy. But if you were to ask me to take a look at like the red lines through a contract and why they were being changed, that was like that wasn't like, yeah, that was so abrasive as an experience, but so important for me.
You feel good when you have it. You feel safe, and then you feel like you could be more productive too, though, once you have those things in place. Because before that, you don't really take yourself seriously. But once you start doing that, you realize, oh, this is what I do, you know, and this is everything about it. Like, you become that brand. So.
Yeah, absolutely. We're using like people like, you know, we were talking about Tarantino. We were talking about like a lot of these people we're holding up as examples of like how to be creative, right? Like, do you think at any point in there, like, you think they're just going in there negotiating their own contracts and negotiating their own, like, no, they got people doing that for them so that they can continue to be creative. And that's one thing that I want. Again, it's not going to land with everybody because they won't have the same privileges that I do, right? Or a lot of, you know, you may have, right? Which is, you know, you get to a point where you can afford to hire people, right? So that you can stay in this creative space. This guy who's helping me distribute all of Arcathena, the people from Iconic Comics, he was talking to me about the promotion aspect of this book, right? Like all the components that need to come into place in order to optimize. I'm not doing any more crowdfunding, by the way. Like, in order to optimize this new space that we're going to be in, which is just like, I'm just going to release the books as I like from a website, from their.com and from mine, and be like, but how do you do it so that it incentivizes people, like all the strategy that goes into that incentivizing. And then, you know, unlike my buddy Tim Lim, who has this book called Common America, really super successful, like incredible climb. And if I can use a playbook, it would be his. As a matter of fact, he's the guy that guided me through all the tall grass that is this crowdfunding space. If I can use a playbook, I'm running his playbook, to be perfectly honest. But like, if I can use his track record and use his success as where I'd want to aspire to, that would be one of them. But Tim has that tenacity. Between him and Mark Pellegrini, who do Common America together, they have the tenacity to go out and crowdfund. I do not, right? And so my point to the Iconic Comics guys was like, how did he phrase it? He's like, you can either go cut your own lawn, right? Or hire somebody to cut it for you so that you can continue doing whatever it is that you need to do on your day-to-day. And I'm like, not many people, he goes like, to be fair, not a lot of people can afford to hire somebody to cut their own lawn. You have to ask yourself whether or not where your time is most valuable. Doing this thing, especially once you can afford it, you can go and do this thing, or you can hand it over to somebody else who's exclusively doing that thing, who does it really, really well, so that you can focus on the thing that you know for sure you're going to be like excellent at. You're going to be exceptional at. Not many people are going to have that same privilege, but I'm in a position now where I'm like, I'm going to go do the thing that I'm really, really good at.
But it's a good aspiration to have.
And I'm going to hire out to people. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not saying, I think it's a worthwhile aspiration. Or something to
keep in the back of your mind, like, hey, I want to get to a point where I can do that. And you, if you're focused on the business aspect of it, you're going to get there because you're conducting yourself a certain way to get to that point. So it's good to have that in the back of your mind and kind of in the, you know, on the way there, instead of like not having it there at all, you know, which I wish someone would have told me that absolutely from the beginning. So definitely.
These are the things that I wish I had like on the list somewhere, but I'm glad now that we're able to talk about it. So hopefully somebody can put it on the list to be like, boy, I would really love to be in a place in which I can do that for myself. That sort of level of self-investment is so critical once you cross a particular threshold.
Well, I'm going to tell everybody right now, you need to invest in yourself.
Yeah. Go invest in yourself by investing in the smart. The other one is like an editor. I never understood how critical it was to have a different pair of eyes. Again, like surrounding yourself with people who are in the business of helping you become successful, who are genuine about it, you know? And that's not just like people that you pay, right? This conversation right now, I'm hanging out with you and we're both like cheering for each other to be successful in the spaces that we're going into. That's what I mean when I'm like, I don't care about the comic book industry. I care about you. I care about you being successful in the thing that you're self-publishing, because through that, I feel like there is a congealing of like really creative, like-minded individuals, right? Similar to whenever I see like, who were those old 70s guys from like, it was Lucas for sure, but then there was like Francis Ford Coppola, and there was like those guys that just hung out. And like,
Spielberg was one of them, right? Was it Spielberg? Yeah.
Exactly. Like Spielberg was in there.
Scorsese, was Scorsese one of them or no? He was?
Yep.
Okay.
I mean, it was just like people who were making films at that time who kind of were in each other's orbit, that were out of the studio system. They just said, screw it, we're going to go make films the way we make films. And eventually they became part of the studio and so on and so forth. Right? I think there are those sets of groups that have like with Tarantino as an example, he was hanging out with Robert Rodriguez and a handful of other directors.
And it started spreading, basically.
Yeah. Right. So it just happens to be that way, but I feel like there's value in that kind of energy, value in that kind of camaraderie, you know? So again, going back to my point of like surrounding yourself with people who are genuinely invested in your success, not just because you're paying them, but because they can see a like-mindedness in your effort, and they're like, well, if they can freaking do it, I want to go do that too. I love that energy.
Well, thank you so much. You make me feel like I could do this now. I might be delusional.
Yeah. No, you didn't need me for that.
No, I did.
You were doing just fine.
I needed you to tell me I could do it.
I'm glad I could, but I don't. Yeah, that's really flattering. But honestly, based on the stuff that I'd seen, we were talking about this offline. You started recording because you were very, very smart. But we were talking about this offline about how I downloaded a couple of your volumes from Amazon, and I thought to myself, like, these kinds of individuals, Siya in specific, but these kinds of individuals are the ones that are really going to have some sort of long-term impact in the kind of space that I want to inhabit, right? Who was I talking to? They were talking about Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman doing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. There was a whole group of people during that time that were doing their own comics, independent of like mainstream, independent of a system. Because number one, stylistically, like that was not very palatable. If you take a look at the style that they were doing, but in context of this story, it was absolutely appropriate. Fast forward to now, don't look at like the TV series that made them gajillion dollars where they were buying tanks or whatever. But like the point is like the creative space that they were all in at that time was so freaking amazing. I want to help be part of that space with people. Like, and I don't care what you're drawing. I don't care the kind of stuff that you're creating, right? The stuff that you're writing. But if you're in this thing, like making stuff with me, I think I want to be part of that group, you know?